I'm very pleased to present Colter Pence, who is the Wilderness, Wild and Scenic Rivers and Trails Program Manager for the Flathead National Forest, and Frankie Romero, who is the Fire Use and Fuels Program Manager for the Forest Service in the Washington office. Colter, Frankie, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'll add in a little detail for myself. For the last 20 years, I've been working with the Forest Service, mainly with the Flathead National Forest. And before that, I worked with the Payette National Forest. And in that both of those locations, I've worked with the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex and the Frank Church Wilderness. And as a wilderness manager in those locations, I've been exposed to wildland fire and the natural role of fire in those wilderness areas. And I also have a small background in fire as well, in that I did start my career doing some operational work like many people do, including heliTAC work, etc. Recently, for the last few years, I've also done assignments with the National Fire Desk as well. With that, I'll turn it over to Frankie to see if he wants to add in any more for himself.
Yeah, thanks, Colter. So hello, everybody. Glad to be here with you. And again, my job title is I'm Fire Use Program Manager for the U.S. Forest Service. I work out of the National Fire Center in Boise, Idaho. I like to tell people I'm the good fire guy. And so a lot of my job duties have to do with taking advantage of wildfire as well as prescribed fire to meet our management objectives. My first wilderness fire was on the Gila National Forest, Gila Wilderness, over 30 years ago. And since then, I've been a fire responder as well as a fire manager on the Gila, on the Frank Church, worked on the Payette, similar to Colter, as well as the Flat Tops wilderness area. And Arthur Carhart's Cradle of Wilderness was in my backyard as a fire manager for a number of years. So wilderness fire has been part of my career trajectory. So it's my pleasure to be here with you to talk a little bit more about the wilderness stewardship performance elements as they relate to natural fire.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's get our review of the natural role of fire element underway. Okay, we have several objectives here. We're going to review in detail the natural role of fire element so that you are able to, we're making an assumption that our audience is primarily wilderness oriented people. Anyway, so we're doing this review for the context so that it will set you up to work with your local fire managers to make progress on this element. We're going to share also some basic fire management organizational information so you have a little context of who is who. We will also share some fire management terminology and framing so that you're a little more informed on that. And last, we're going to share how to accomplish the various stewardship tasks embedded within this element. We're not planning to discuss in detail wilderness fire management theory extensively. We will hit on it a little bit, but the point being is we're focused on how to work with the natural role of fire element. So as we get started here, I'd like to call up our first poll for the audience. We'd like to check in with how well aware our audience is of this element in general so we can target ourselves a little bit. If you're not able to see the poll, don't panic. Put a comment in the chat. Just has to do with how your particular system is configured. But the question is how familiar are you with the natural role of fire? We're seeing some response here. And basically, if you need to put your answer in the chat, you can tell us, I have no idea. I'm just here to learn, all the way up to I'm actively working on this stewardship element. So go ahead and give us your response there. We'll give it a little more time here. We're almost there. We can see on our end how many people have voted. It looks like 5 of you have not yet. So last chance to vote. Otherwise, we're going to close it. Okay, let's go ahead and close and share the results. Okay, so looking at these results here, it looks like the majority of our audience have not yet worked with this wilderness stewardship performance element, and you're curious to get the foundations, the basics. So that's great. I hope we meet your needs. And next behind that is that you're aware your unit is working on this and you've read about it, but you've not worked directly with it. Ideally, I'd like to think by the end of our session, we've all moved you a little higher on that scale today. So thanks for letting us know where you stand with this. Okay, let's go ahead here and I'll turn it over to Frankie for an organizational review.
All right, so we wanted to kind of give you guys a little bit of just background and familiarization. So, you know, this whole exercise has to do with Wilderness and Fire coming together to look over the program and do some evaluation. So if folks are not terribly familiar, we wanted to make sure you're a little bit oriented to how fire is organized. So at the forest level, typically we will see the terms fire staff officer and forest FMO or fire management officer, sometimes used interchangeably, but for the most part, those are separate and distinct duties and responsibilities. So a staff officer is someone who's reporting directly to the forest supervisor. Depending on where you work, you may or may not have a specific fire staff officer. Sometimes fire is rounded out with another staff officer's duties and responsibilities. Sometimes they're standalone. And oftentimes you will hear fire or a forest FMO used. Oftentimes the FMO reports directly to a staff officer, either a fire staff officer, or in those cases where a staff officer has other duties besides fire underneath their purview, that FMO would report to that staff officer. So if you're looking for who to track down at the forest level, it's okay to start with either one, but just so that you know, sometimes forest FMO may or may not be at the staff officer level. We can hop to the next one. And so looking a little more closely at the district level, you know, very often you're going to have a cohort there with your program managers, and the fire management officer at the district level is essentially a program manager over the fire organization. So you would have a counterpart there as a wilderness program manager with your fire management officer. We're seeing more and more often that sometimes with our fuels programs, particularly those forests that have very large fuels programs, sometimes the fuels function is split out from underneath the fire management organization. And that's something for you to be aware of, because sometimes the fuel specialist, a lot of times they have a background in fire ecology, and so they may, depending on locale, may be assigned some duties and responsibilities with working with wilderness. Also, we see it pretty common, especially forests where there's one particular district that has a wilderness area associated with it, that sometimes the coordination with wilderness can occur at the district level with one of the district fire management officers as opposed to the forest. So that's something for you to find out when you get back home if you haven't already. So another thing we wanted to go over is you will hear the term federal fire policy thrown about pretty loosely. And a lot of times we are not really familiar with what that means. So just so that you're oriented, when we talk about federal fire policy in the U.S. Forest Service, we are talking about two key documents. The first is the review and update of the 1995 Federal Wildland Fire Management Policy. So this was in 1995, after the Storm King incident and loss of life associated with that in 1994, this was kind of the first federal wildland fire management policy that was developed amongst all the federal agencies and bureaus, and it is aspirational. So there are principles in this document which we still aspire to. This was reviewed again in 2001, and some minor changes were made, but essentially the original document from 1995 kind of stands as our aspirational document for where fire management in the federal bureaus are hoping to go. The other part is the guidance for implementation. So the 5 federal land management agencies kind of went out on their own and developed this additional guidance that kind of defines how are we as federal land management agencies intending to go about implementing this aspirational work, which is the January 2001 document. So those 2 documents combined are really what make up federal fire policy. Hop to the next one. So I wanted, if you haven't picked these up, I do encourage you to give them a read. They're not difficult reads, but if I was going to take the multiple pages of this federal fire policy and try to sum it up for you, I would tell you that what this thing says is that fire management is a fundamental part of managing our natural resources. We know that we have to control fires when we need to protect values, but we also intend to use fire to our advantage whenever the opportunity presents itself. And throughout the document, you will see that the emphasis is that any action that we take is with the highest regard for protecting human life first and foremost. So the guidance for implementation, I do suggest that if you get a chance to take a look at this, because a lot of the terminology that our fire folks are using now is going to come from this document, and it'd be good for you if you were familiar with it. So I'm going to go over a couple of those right now. So the most important concepts to know is that wildland fire is a general term describing any non-structure fire that occurs in the wildland. So any combustion that's going on out in the woods or out in the grassland is considered a wildland fire. Wildland fire is broke out into 2 distinct types. If it was unplanned, we describe that as a wildfire. If it was a planned ignition for management purposes, that's a prescribed fire. And those are the only 2 classifications that this current guidance offers. It's a little bit different if you've been around for a while. In a previous guide, wildfires was with unwanted fires or bad fires. So that's a distinct change that it'd be good for you to make sure you're aware of. Under the current policy guidance, wildfires does not mean it's either good or bad or unfavorable or favorable. It's just an unplanned ignition, and it's an important concept to keep in mind. Another important concept is that a wildland fire may be concurrently managed for 1 or more objectives, and the objectives can change as the fire spreads across the landscape. So again, in a previous guidance document, there was a process and a procedure where we would categorize fires shortly after discovery, and we would either bin them as a good fire or a bad fire, and then we would respond to them according to that categorization. Like under this new guidance, well, it's not that new, it's 2009, but under the current guidance, we can manage for multiple objectives, and so we can manage a fire that is potentially doing both favorable and unfavorable things in terms of effects. And so we are no longer categorizing fires in a good or bad bin, just knowing that, hey, good and bad things can occur, and we got to manage for all of them concurrently. So that's an important concept. So again, if I were asked to summarize what this guide is all about, I would encourage you to latch on to these concepts. There's 2 types of wildland fire. Fires, the ones that are unplanned, and prescribed fires, the ones that we did plan. We can manage fires for 1 or more objectives at the same time, and we can change our mind if the situation changes. And we are focused in all of our activities on protection of human life, both public and responders, We're interested in actions to reduce the immediate threats to the resources and assets, but we're also looking for strategies that consider both present and future threats to people, resources, and assets. And that includes wilderness values as well. So. And then one last thing, when you're talking to fire folks, a lot of times they're going to be referring to our annual target accomplishments. And one of the things with wilderness fires is they are eligible in most cases to be counted as fuels target accomplishment in our annual reporting. And so just be aware that in the brains and minds of fire folks that are looking to achieve targets and accomplish their goals and objectives in terms of fire, they've got this in the back of their mind. And so we do have the ability to count naturally occurring wildfires as target accomplishment. However, one change that we've made in the business rules in the last several years is that the forest, while they're doing all the work, don't necessarily get to count that directly. It's kind of aggregated across the region and nationally. And the reason for that is there was worry and concern that particular forests might be unintentionally pressured into taking risks that they might not otherwise take in allowing some fires to perform their natural role. And so this business rule is intended to kind of take that pressure off of them and encourage folks to do what's right according to the landscape and for the resource without that extra pressure of trying to make target accomplishments. So just for your awareness, that's going on in the background of most fire folks' brains.
Okay, so like we said at the beginning here, our focus of this session is on the wilderness stewardship performance natural role of fire element. Frankie just gave us some background and context that and even recommendations for reading and looking at some materials so that you can get a little stronger just in general on fire policy. And so let's turn our focus to the wilderness stewardship performance element here. On the screen is the cover page for the guidebook. The most recent version, it was updated this spring. It's updated annually as needed. And it's out there on the various platforms it's available on, which we will review at the end of this presentation where it's located. Some background on the natural role of fire element. It's found within the cluster of elements that fit within the natural quality of wilderness character. That makes perfect sense, right? The natural role of fire relates to the natural quality of wilderness. And within that particular cluster, the natural quality, each wilderness area was asked to choose 1 to 3 elements. It's not a required selection. So for wilderness areas that it was not well suited for, they probably passed on that. Whereas for wilderness areas that thought it was well suited for them to work on, they did select that. And it looks like 265 wilderness areas of the 448 did select it. So this is actually one of the highest selected non-required elements of all of them. It's 5th highest. So there are many wilderness areas across the country working on the natural role of fire and the stewardship work behind that. It's more than half of the wilderness areas. So this is important stewardship work for many wilderness managers and fire managers as well. Okay, so what we have on the screen here is a snap of the first page of the information in the this element. And just to orient you, it has things like definitions, key terms. And so take the time to review that when you're ready to dive in and make sure you're familiar with just the very premise and core concepts on that first page. Here is an overview of the various scoring levels, and we're going to dive into the details of each scoring level here in a minute. But I first would like for you to observe that there's a cluster of scoring at the beginning. That's the 2, 4, 6 levels, and those each build upon each other successively. You cannot claim the 6-point level without having adequately done the 2 and the 4-point level. You have to do the work to build up to that. Whereas at the bottom of the screen there are also 2 checkboxes that are 2 points each. And those are independent accomplishment tasks. They don't build upon each other. They do relate to the other tasks, but they are not obligate to those. the two, those two 2-point things, those are things which need to be done annually, whereas the 2 to 4 level can be done one time and will endure for a long time. So there's cycles here to look at a little more closely, and we will take a little more time for that. Let's go ahead and look at the very beginning, the 2-point level, which is the first step you want to take out or take on. This is that you've checked in your forest plan that there's adequate fire management direction in there. This task can be done one time. If it's adequate, it will endure for some time, as long as the fire management direction for your wilderness does not change and the forest plan direction does not change. But we're going to take a closer look with Frankie is what is a good representation in a forest plan for fire management direction here. So we'll turn it over to Frankie.
Yeah, so when you're kind of looking at this, you know, one of the things to be aware of is the land management plan, how it addresses fire. So particularly, you know, most of our Forest Service land management plans, the original set were kind of created in 1980s. If you look at the language in a lot of those, fire is described more as a disturbance. And there's little, if any, discussion on fire's role as a natural process in that first set. Some of them may have, but it's important for you to take a look at the language and how fire is described. Just because there's a section on fire doesn't mean it is necessarily discussing fire as a natural process, whether it's in or outside of wilderness. So that's something to take a look at. Generally speaking, if your forest plan does speak to the role of fire in wilderness, that's usually good enough for the 2-point here. So, you know, there's always room for improvement and language and concepts change, but if it is addressed, that typically hits all points for this particular one. So, you know, again, looking at how your plan addressed the role of fire within wilderness, the language may not be perfect, but as long as it's the key point to keep in mind, we're gonna in the next slide, some maybe flags to be aware of as you're looking through your land management plan and how it addresses it. So we can hop on to the next one. Colter. So at this point, I think we're going to be talking about the checklist, and so I'm guessing that you all are familiar with the checklist, and if not, then Colter and Eric can provide that one as well. But you know, this next part gets to the process of having gone through the checklist with your fire management folks, and this is one of those things that it has to happen together. It doesn't work great if it's just one or the other kind of going through it. So this is one of those activities that really requires both wilderness program and fire program to sit down together and work through the checklist as a team and give it your best assessment. So once you've worked through it once, it doesn't need to be redone very often. It should endure, but it is one of those things that it does take a little bit of work and some time set aside for both programs. And so, you know, that this next element, the 4-point, you know, what we're really looking at there is, have you engaged in this dialogue and worked through the checklist with fire management and wilderness together. If you have engaged in this and you've worked through the checklist and you're satisfied that either you address the items that are in there, or if they can't be addressed or are justified for why they're in the condition they are, then the full 4 points for that element, you should go ahead and score those. So to not score this one basically just means that you haven't taken the time yet to sit down with fire and work your way through this checklist. So that it's not a high bar. If you've made it through there, then you should be getting the full 4 for having done that work. And so a little bit of the thing to watch out for is the outdated terminology. And so that guide that we talked about earlier came about in 2009. So if there was any amendments to your forest plan that addressed the natural role of fire, if those were done prior to 2009, you might see a little bit of dated language, but that's okay. And that's where some of your justifications might say, hey, the terminology might be a little bit dated, but it still adequately addresses our needs for management. Some of the language you might see in there talks to things like requires a fire management plan, or there's some criteria. We can only allow fires under energy release components, the ERC, below 50. Some of those older plans had criteria like that. And talk to your fire management folks. Those criteria may or may not still be applicable. Let me jump to the next slide. So you'll see some terminology. Wildland fire use. Fire use is still a term we use, and I use it in my job title. When you stick wildland on the front of that, that was a particular term that was used in an earlier guide. That's no longer in use. There is prescribed natural fire, which predates wildland fire use. And so if you see that one, that means your plan is really old and it hasn't been looked at for a while. And other terms like maximum manageable area, wildland fire situation analysis, EFSA, WFSA, and basically, like I said earlier, any plan or amendment that was signed before 2009 is probably suspect. It was done under an earlier management regime, but it may still be adequate. Just take a look at it, have that discussion with your fire management folks, and you might still, with justification, say it meets the need, even though it might be dated. And this is just an example that I pulled out of an amendment that was done on a particular forest, and you'll see, terms like wildland fire use pop up, and there's language describing that might be pretty hard to read, but there was criteria in there that was pretty specific. And so making sure that your fire folks are aware of that and can speak to whether or not that criteria is still valid or not would be an important thing to work through this checklist process.
Okay, now that we've reviewed the 4-point level, let's take a look at the 6-point level, and I'll get us started with this. So the summary takeaway for the 6-point level is that, and if you look to the far side there, it's something that is done annually, that the response for each wildfire that occurred in the last fiscal year did meet the applicable fire management direction. So that's where your work at the 2- and 4-point level sets you up for working through the 6-point level. Those checks that you did, does your forest plan have adequate direction? Does it have a lot of those details that make for higher level performance and adequate direction for managing natural fires? That those checks that you did is what you now go back and compare to. Did the fire that occurred in the last year meet the intent of the plan? Let's see here, I'm scanning my notes here. I'm going to show you a little bit here in how this works, but just know that if you don't do this review, you can't claim the 6-point level. So for me, what this looks like is, in the wilderness that I work with, we sit down in the winter or the early spring, and we go back and call up all of the fires that occurred in our wilderness in the past year and compare it to the forest plan. Did this fire meet the intentions of the plan? Did something unexpected come up, et cetera? And we work through that together as a wilderness program and as a fire management program together. If a fire did not meet the planning direction, then you need to cycle back and get to the bottom of that. Please note that if a wilderness area did not have a fire in the wilderness that year to evaluate, you may still claim this level by indicating not applicable. You're not penalized if your wilderness did not have a fire in the past year. Though I want to make a recommendation that maybe you sit down as a wilderness and fire program and still find a healthy way to have a conversation and review your overall plan, or talk about something that keeps that relationship going. So consider still doing that. So again, key points here. Did you follow the plan for each and every fire? So some years that could be 1 fire, for some years that could be 20 fires. Your list could vary from year to year. Did following the plan, and reminder, following the plan might mean that some fires were suppressed if that's what the plan allowed for. Ideally, we will have fires where the natural role was held to and that the wilderness objectives were followed. But if the plan says that some fires may be suppressed, that means you were in compliance with that, with the plan, if that's what happened. Okay, let's take a look at the check boxes. I'm going to summarize both of these here. Part of the intent here for the first 2-point checkbox is about that post-season review. So in a sense, I sort of feel like these are almost backwards. So work with me here. That 2-point checkbox, the first one, it's asking that you do a review and you sit down and review the effectiveness of the plan. If we look back at the 6-point level, it is asking you what were the results of that review, okay? So you, in order to achieve the 6-point level, you also need to do that check-in at the 2-point level, or excuse me, the 2-point checkbox level. So there's a relationship between those two there. The second checkbox there, which can also be done when you sit down and do that review, is a check on, did all of the fires that were appropriate, and we'll break that down in a minute here, but did all of the appropriate fires have a wilderness resource advisor assigned to them? If there was not a resource advisor assigned to one, and in hindsight maybe there should have been, well, you are not going to claim that 2-point checkbox. Whereas if you did a great job and you got resource advisors assigned to those fires, you're going to claim that 2-point checkbox. So you can do that sit down, check on your resource advisor situation, do that effective, or planning review, accomplish both of the check boxes, and then that sets you up for accomplishing the 6-point level as well. So just consider the relationship between those there. So a little more detail here for that 2-point checkbox. That's the post-season review. For me, what that looks like in my area, we go fire by fire and name one. Okay, the Pyramid Fire, the Edna Creek Fire, and then was it a suppression fire? Or did we allow fire to play its natural role? Did the management strategy change? Were there major events that affected the management strategy? Did we meet the direction in the fire management plan? If it didn't, what can we do to follow up with that? And we also incorporate a lessons learned for each fire. I recommend that. That's a concept many of us are familiar with. What did we learn from that? What would we have done differently? And I'll use an example here. We had a fire a few years ago in my area in the Middle Fork of the Flathead where we apparently broke, and it was a suppression fire in the wilderness, but we broke records for hella retardant drops, apparently, like the volume per hour kind of a thing. And in hindsight, we don't think that was something to be proud of, and we don't think that was the right a way to suppress that fire. And so we had some conversations with those that were involved afterwards and learned some lessons from that. Okay, you also want to take a moment and confirm that you have all of the motor mech authorizations associated with that fire in order. You're going to be reporting that to NRM as well. And here's a good chance to check in and make sure you have those motor mech authorizations related to fire, have all of that in order. And then, like I said, you can also do your check-in on the 6-point level, or excuse me, the on the reads as well. So think I'll move on to the wilderness read checkbox, and I think Frankie was going to tackle this one.
Yeah, so in that checkbox, it kind of the way it's currently described is it talks about, you know, if folks were suppressing a fire, or if it was a suppression fire, you know, my advice is kind of ignore that suppression response and don't read it so literally. We have responders deployed regardless of what instructions we told them, whether they're intended to suppress the fire, or oftentimes they're there to monitor or protect specific values in the area. So they may or may not be deployed with the specific task of performing suppression, but just be aware of that and recognize that read support is still recommended anytime folks are deployed to respond to a fire, regardless of what their task is. Also, in the description on that checkbox, it specifies type 5 and type 4 documentation or fires. And you know, I would take that with a grain of salt. You know, the type 4 and type 5 fires, those are the smallest and shortest duration fires, fire incidents we usually have. And you know, a lot of times they're so short that a resource advisor may or may not be assigned. But it's also good to also just recognize, you know, where did the resource advising function occur, and did it occur? Oftentimes it's direct conversation between the wilderness program manager and the fire management officer or duty officer that was in charge of operations that day. That counts, and that's important. Oftentimes we also see where the district ranger, for example, or line officer may retain that authority to be the resource advisor and speak directly to fire management on what their expectations are for the resource. So if that function was fulfilled, whether or not it was by a qualified read or somebody else, that still counts. And certainly for larger fires, type 1, 2, and 3 fires, we should see some documentation that resource advisors were assigned and were active in providing information to those incidents.
And I want to add on here, from my perspective as a wilderness manager, that I concur and agree that for many of our smaller fires that are their timelines are short, and I'm talking type 5, type 4, whether they're suppressed or they just have a naturally short life cycle, that it from the wilderness manager standpoint and a wilderness read standpoint, for me, what that's looked like in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, that sometimes looks like a short phone call with the IC or the duty officer, a hallway conversation on, hey, heads up, okay, a couple things to consider here. We will, if this fire has a longer life and more management response, we'll ramp up as a wilderness read advisor. But for the very short term, there's still a check-in, still a conversation, and we will check the box that consultation happened and that meets the intent for that 2-point checkbox. I think Frankie's going to share an example here for us.
Yeah, and this is just the example I'm familiar with. Frank Church for no return back in 2018. There was a lot of people deployed. It was essentially a type 3 organization with resources deployed with the intent of protecting some values that were threatened, in particular a guard station, some facilities owned by Idaho Department of Game and Fish. But their instructions were not to necessarily, suppress or interfere with the fire's natural movement and progression through the wilderness. But this was one of those instances where, even though it wasn't a suppression assignment, there was a lot of people out there, there was a lot of equipment, there was camps, and having the wilderness read involved was certainly important to the success of this one.
Okay, and Frankie, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to jump us ahead just a little bit here and point out that in the Wilderness Stewardship Performance Guidebook, after there is the elements called out that we just reviewed for you, there's also frequently asked questions, explainer notes, And much of the little clarifications we were just giving is in that supporting resources, those explainer notes and the footnotes. So plan to check that out. And I think what I'd like to jump to here is our final poll. I don't even think I have a slide for that, but our last poll, and that is because we're committed to trying to improve on the information and support resources for this element. So what do you need more information on? Where do you need a little more help so that we can work on that and try to provide you more resources, whether it's additional training or examples, etc. So let us know where you could use a little more support, and we can work on that going forward. See a few results coming in here. And then when we're done with this, I think we should turn to questions. Only 3 out of 28 people have voted. Goodness.
Still reading it.
Yeah, and again, if you're not able to see the poll, go ahead and put in the chat box which of the items in this element you could use more support on. Okay, we still got votes coming in. You can't see it live, but we can on this end. We see stuff happening there, so that's why we're being quiet. Okay, it feels like we're pretty stable. Let's go ahead and close the voting and you can see the results. Okay, it looks like the majority were looking for more support and information on the checklist. Thank you for that, followed by doing that, confirming that the response to each wildfire met applicable management direction. Could use some more information around that. Okay. I don't know if Eric, if you're able to capture that a little bit here for us to follow up with here, but okay. With that, I think it's appropriate to open it up for questions. I'll go back and review in the chat if any came in, and Eric can help us track down questions as well.
So far at this time, Colter, we do not have any questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat box. It looks like we have about 31 people. If you actually would prefer to verbalize your question, you can take yourself off of mute and ask your question that way as well. If it gets unruly, David will just mute everybody again.
I think I see a comment from Matt here, and what I'm interpreting is that one of the challenges with this part of wilderness stewardship is working with the fire program, that it needs to be a part of working on this element, needs to be a part of their performance standards. And so I'm inferring that maybe you've struggled to get cooperation or coordination on that one. And I guess I understand that challenge. And it comes down to the relationships that you work on and build. And if it's not a priority for somebody, it's not a priority for somebody. But at the same time, I will remind you, forest supervisors do have performance responsibilities for wilderness stewardship performance. And so if you're able to have a conversation about, hey, we're not in relation to your forest staff and forest supervisor, and letting them know, I think there's more work we could do to increase our scoring and more work to do to increase stewardship. Can we get some direction to have more time between the fire program and the wilderness program? Can we get more direction to get more cooperation? Perhaps that's a strategy for you. I don't know if Frankie, you have any advice on that one?
Yeah, so I would throw out there, from the fire program perspective, yes, they do have responsibility to be responsive and cooperative in helping wilderness achieve their program goals. And the same goes for timber and cultural archaeology, and so all the other program areas that are affected by fire. Your fire managers have equal responsibility to engage with them to make sure the fire program is working in concert with their goals and objectives as well. And so it does become one of those things that managing that workload sometimes, depending on your fire management organization, can be a challenge for them. And I'd agree with Colter that if the workload is such that they're unable to give you the time that you need to work through this process and make sure your program area is working along these lines as best they can, certainly bring that up with your line officers and staff officers and your counterpart. It's supposed to be a team effort. And just let your fire management folks know that, hey, I'm concerned and I'm going to bring it up. So give them a heads up so they don't get blindsided. But recognize their workload and responsibilities for other program areas as well.
I want to add on one more thought, back to the relationship side of things. Like, I've worked hard. It's not easy. I don't take that for granted, and no one should. I worked hard to build relationships in the fire program and sustain them so that I can go and have these conversations. So don't just expect that that rolls easily. My example is I've worked hard at that over the years. And then secondly, I think one approach to start the conversation is, and I have found it effective, is that the fire staff people that I work with, they do want to do the right thing when it comes to appropriate management response to wilderness fires. They do want to allow fire to play its natural role when they can, when the circumstances are right, et cetera. And so I've approached them on, if we do this pre-work, if we work on this annually, if we work on these things that need to be done, we will do the things that you want to, we will be more capable of doing the things that you want to do, that you think's right for the area. So consider that as the talking point. It's not just in their best interest, it will help them achieve the results they want for fire management for that area. Eric, I don't think I'd have the capacity to answer the question from Stephen.
Yeah, and I'm going to answer this the best I can, but we are also out of time, so I'm most likely just going to have to reach out to Stephen as well. So one of the things Stephen asks is, why is the natural role of fire not included in wilderness character monitoring baselines? Or is it somewhere I'm not aware of it? Tracking fire actions are included in the untrammeled measures and authorized motor mech tool uses, but would it be beneficial to the fire program and wilderness character monitoring programs to have its own measures? So if you're not aware of wilderness character monitoring, for those of you still on, there is several sessions on wilderness character monitoring I encourage you to look at or participate in. So like you said, it is to some extent, we track the actions associated with fire. And that's really what wilderness character monitoring is about, is monitoring actions over time and trends in our management actions. So I would say it is, and I guess, the bigger question, I may reach out to you outside of this, are you looking at how fire plays its role, acres burned, those types of things, whereas wilderness character monitoring is really tracking those management actions and what are we doing with our trends over time. So I think from the trends aspect, we are covering it pretty well. And I'll just reach out to you again with some of the wilderness character monitoring staff to get a better perspective of your question, and maybe we can get a little dive into it a little bit more. Yeah, Colter.
I will add it, and we would need to have a follow-up conversation here, but for the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, we are just getting going with wilderness character monitoring, and we have included a custom or locally developed measure around the natural role of fire, but it has more to do with the extent of the response. And so I'm willing to share that with anybody, but now is not the right time. So perhaps that's where you were going, is can you create a local measure? You can, but you got to be really smart. And it's fitting in the untrammeled column, not in the natural column, if that makes sense for you. So
yeah, and similar to wilderness stewardship performance, we do have a measure that's that generic other. Wilderness character monitoring has that same opportunity to create critical locally determined measures that are not the standard just list of 29 that are in there. So that is an option. Okay, we are running low on time. If anybody has any final questions, please add them in the chat. I will do a save of the questions, and we will get back to you for things that we could not respond to in time. But thank you, Frankie. Thank you, Colter, for giving us a little bit more information about the natural world fire element within wilderness stewardship performance.